He said it would be good for me. Those were his exact words. He called on a Thursday evening while I was standing in my kitchen eating leftover pasta over the sink the way a man who has stopped setting the table does, and he said, "Marcus, I have someone I want you to meet. It will be good for you." And I said, "Danny, the last time you said something would be good for me, you convinced me to run a half marathon with 3 weeks of training, and I couldn't walk properly for a month." He said this was different. I said, "Fine." I said when and where, and I hung up and went back to the pasta and did not think about it again until Friday evening when I was changing into something that wasn't what I wore to work and looking at myself in the mirror in the way you look at yourself when you have been alone long enough that you have stopped fully registering what you look like. Danny had given me a name, just a first name, Simone. He said she was someone his wife had known for a long time, someone warm and sharp and worth an evening. And that was the full briefing. I drove to the restaurant he had chosen, which was the kind of place where the booths are deep and the lighting is amber and there is enough ambient noise to make silence comfortable rather than pointed. And I gave my name to the host and followed him to a table near the back. She was already seated. She was reading something on her phone with her head tilted slightly and her hair pulled back. And she looked up when I was 3 steps away, and what happened to my face in that moment is something I am still not entirely able to describe accurately. Her name was Simone Ardell. She was my ex-wife's younger sister. She had been 15 years old at my wedding. She looked at me the way I must have been looking at her, which was the look of a person receiving information their brain is not ready to file correctly. A kind of rapid, silent renegotiation happening behind the eyes, while the face tries to hold a neutral position and does not entirely succeed. She said, "Marcus." I said, "Simone." She said, "Danny didn't tell you." I said, "Danny didn't tell me." She said, "He didn't tell me either." She set her phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands need something deliberate to do. "I found out your last name when I was in the car 5 minutes ago. I Googled you because Danny only gave me a first name and I wanted to know something about you before I walked in." I said, "What did you find?" She said, "Your LinkedIn." And then I sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes deciding whether to come in. I said, "What made you come in?" She said, "I decided that if I drove home I would never know whether it was a mistake to drive home, and I can't live with that kind of question." She looked at me steadily. "Sit down, Marcus." I sat down. There was a silence, the kind that has specific weight, that you can feel pressing on all sides. The candle between us was burning. The restaurant continued its warm, indifferent life around us, and we sat in the middle of it like two people who have been handed a situation with no manual and are privately doing the math. I said, "How long has it been?" She said, "Since the wedding?" 12 years. Since I've seen you at all?" She thought about it. 9. The last family event before the separation. I said, "You were 27. She said, "You counted." I said, "I'm doing the math in real time. I'm not doing it well." She almost smiled at that, the almost smile of a person keeping something in reserve until they know where the evening is actually going. She said, "How long has it been since the divorce was finalized?" I said, 3 years. She said, I knew approximately. I wasn't sure of the exact timeline." I said, "Are you still close with Claire?" The name sat in the air between us for a moment. My ex-wife's name, her sister's name. The person who connected us and complicated every possible version of this evening. Simone said, "We're close the way sisters who have had a hard few years are close. Which means we talk every week, and there are things we don't talk about, and we both know which things those are." She paused. "You're one of the things we don't talk about." Not because Claire is angry. Because it's easier for both of us to let that part be quiet. I said, "Does she know you're here tonight?" Simone said, "She doesn't know Danny set this up. She doesn't know your name came up. I didn't know your name was going to come up." She picked up her water glass, set it down. I don't think I should call her from the restaurant bathroom to inform her, if that's what you're asking. I said, "I wasn't asking that." She said, "Then what were you asking?" I said, "I was asking because I want to understand what tonight is, what it can be, because the shape of it matters before either of us says anything else." She looked at me for a long moment. The amber light caught her eyes in a way that made them look exactly like Claire's, and nothing like Claire's simultaneously, which is the particular strangeness of siblings, the ways they carry the same features to completely different conclusions. She said, "I think tonight is what it is. Two adults in a restaurant who didn't plan to be here together and are here anyway. The rest of it, Claire, the family, the history, that's real and it's not going to disappear because we ignore it over dinner. But it also doesn't have to decide what this is before we've even ordered." I said, "That's a very composed thing to say." She said, "I've had 6 minutes longer to process it than you have." I was in the parking lot. The waiter arrived. We ordered without the particular ceremony of people who are performing an evaluation of each other. She got the halibut. I got the steak. He disappeared, and the silence returned, but it had changed quality, the way a room feels different after you've opened a window, the same space, more air in it. I said, "I want to say something before we go any further." She said, "Say it." I said, "I know how this looks from the outside. I know that a man having dinner with his ex-wife's younger sister is the kind of situation that gets a specific reading before anyone knows the details. I want you to know I'm aware of that. And that I am not going to pretend it's uncomplicated, because pretending things are simpler than they are is something I have already spent too much of my life doing." She looked at me steadily. She said, "That's a notable thing to lead with." I said, "I've had 3 years to understand the specific ways I operated badly inside my marriage. One of the main ones was managing the presentation of things, rather than saying the true version. I would rather say the true version here and see where it lands than spend this dinner calibrating." She said, "Claire said you were honest." That arrived differently than I expected it to. I said, "When did she say that?" She said, "In general, over the years." She said you were honest about the things you felt, less honest about the things you wanted, and that the gap between those two was where the marriage got difficult. She paused. She wasn't saying it critically. She was saying it the way you describe someone you understand, eventually. I said, "She understood me better than I understood myself for most of it." She said, "That's true of a lot of relationships, I think. One person sees the shape of the thing more clearly than they have the language for yet, and the other person is still working out what there is to see." I said, "Which one were you, in yours?" She said, "The one still working it out. The one who needed 12 months and a structural engineering degree to understand what had been in front of me the whole time." She picked up her water glass. I spent a year being angry at myself about that. My therapist helped me understand that the working out was the process, not the failure, that you don't get to skip it, you only get to do it faster or slower. I said, "Your therapist sounds good." She said, "She's excellent. She charges accordingly." I said, "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with your family." She looked at me with something that was not quite surprise. She said, "That's a specific request." I said, "I know you as the younger sister and the bridesmaid and the family events. I don't know you as a person. I'd like to." She was quiet for a moment. deciding something. Then she said, "I'm a structural engineer. I design pedestrian bridges, specifically the kind that go over rivers in cities, the ones people use every day without thinking about them. I have one going up in Portland right now that I've been working on for 2 years, and when it opens in the spring, I'm going to fly out there and stand on it on the first morning and watch people walk across it and not think about it for even 1 second, and that's going to be the best day of my year." I said, "You build things people walk across without looking down." She said, "Most good infrastructure is invisible. The point isn't to be noticed. The point is to hold." I said, "How long have you been doing it?" She said, 8 years. I went back for my master's when I was 25. Everyone thought I was redirecting after a bad breakup, which was true, but the redirection turned out to be the right thing regardless of what caused it. She looked at me. "Your turn." "Something that has nothing to do with the family." I said, "I restore old radios. Analog, the kind from the 30s and 40s with the wood cases and the fabric speaker covers. I find them at estate sales, and I take them apart and put them back together until they work again. I have 14 in my apartment, and I listen to exactly none of them. Because the restoration is the part I'm interested in, not the object at the end of it." She said, "That's melancholy." I said, "My therapist says the same thing." She said, "What does she say about it?" I said, "That I am more comfortable with broken things than whole ones, and that I find it easier to invest in the process of repair than in the thing that exists afterward. That the radios are a very safe relationship because they can't leave once you've fixed them." I picked up my glass. She's very good at her job. Simone looked at me. She said, "Are you still going?" I said, "Every other week. More often when I need it." She said, "I went for 2 years after my last relationship ended, the one that sent me back for my master's." She paused. She told me that I was very good at understanding other people's structures and not very good at letting people understand mine, which is apparently a thing that happens to engineers. I said, "Is it still true?" She said, "Less than it was. I'm better at it than I used to be." She looked at me with the directness of someone who has practiced being direct. "Why did your marriage end?" The question arrived cleanly, without softness, but also without edge. I said, "That's a significant question for a first dinner." She said, "I know. I'm asking it anyway, because I knew Claire for her whole life, and I know what she's told me, and I don't know your side of it. And I think if we're going to be in this room together for the next 2 hours, I would rather know than not know." I said, "What did she tell you?" She said, "That you were present in your career in a way you weren't able to be at home, that the marriage had been quiet for longer than either of you admitted, that the end was not dramatic, no specific event, no confrontation, just the accumulation of all the small things you don't address until they've built into a wall you don't know how to get through." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "Is there anything she left out?" I said, "She left out that I knew for about 2 years that we had stopped making each other better, and that I stayed anyway because leaving felt like an admission of failure. And I think she knew it too and stayed for similar reasons, and by the time we finally said it out loud, we had both been grieving the marriage for so long that the actual ending felt more like relief than loss." I looked at the table for a moment. She deserved someone who knew earlier. So did I. Simone said, "She doesn't talk about it that way." I said, "How does she talk about it?" She said, "Like it was something that happened to both of you rather than something either of you did," which I think is generous, coming from her. I said, "She always was, more than I gave her credit for while we were inside it." There was a silence. Not uncomfortable, not the silence of things unsaid, but the particular quiet of two people sitting inside something true that doesn't need elaborating. The food arrived. We ate. The restaurant moved around us, and neither of us said anything for several minutes. And I noticed that the quiet did not feel like avoidance. It felt like two people comfortable enough to not fill the air between bites. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You've already asked me several things." I said, "This one is different. When you were in the parking lot for those 4 minutes, what were you actually deciding?" She was quiet. She set down her fork. She said, "I was deciding whether I was the kind of person who walked into complicated situations or the kind who drove away from them." Which sounds abstract, but it wasn't. In that specific moment, it was very concrete. She looked at me. I've driven away from things before. A relationship that was good, but required me to tell my family something I wasn't ready to tell them. A job in another city that would have been right but felt like too much disruption at the time. I have a history of choosing the version of a thing that makes fewer demands and finding out later that I wanted the version that made more. I said, "And this?" She said, "I'm here, Marcus." I said, "You're here." She said, "I'm not making any claim about what that means beyond the present tense. I'm just saying that the 4 minutes happened and I made a choice, and I'm sitting across from you, and I would like to finish my halibut." I said, "I need to ask you something." She said, "Ask it." I said, "Does Claire know anyone who eats at this restaurant? Anyone who might be here tonight?" She understood immediately why I was asking. She looked around the room once, quickly, then back at me. She said, "Her college roommate lives 3 blocks from here. We had dinner near here once, 2 years ago, but not this restaurant." I said, "Okay," she said. "You're thinking about what happens if she finds out from someone other than me." I said, "I'm thinking about the fact that you said you'd call her, and I want you to have the chance to do that before the situation gets complicated in a direction neither of us controlled." She said, "It's Friday night. She goes to her mother's on Friday nights for dinner. She's not going to be in this neighborhood at 9:30. She paused. "But I appreciate that you thought of it." I said, "I was inside that family for 10 years. I know the geography." She said, "Yes, you do." She looked at me with something that had shifted slightly, a new layer of recognition. "That's what makes this strange. You know my mother's dinner schedule. You know which sister I fought with at Christmas and why. You know the family the way someone knows it from the inside, and I know almost nothing about you beyond the outline." I said, "What do you want to know?" She said, "Everything, but let's start with something real." I said, "That seems reasonable." She said, "I think so." I watched her eat for a moment, which I was aware was an odd thing to do, but there was something in the quality of her attention, the way she was fully in the room and not managing her presentation of being in the room, that I had not expected and could not stop noticing. I said, "Your sister is one of the most self-contained people I've ever known. I mean that as a genuine observation, not a criticism." She said, "I know what you mean. She processes everything internally and presents you with the conclusion, very little visible working out." I said, "Yes, exactly that." She said, "I'm the opposite. I work everything out in public, which some people find exhausting." I said, "I don't find it exhausting." She said, "You've known me for 90 minutes. I said, "It's been a dense 90 minutes. She said, "That's fair." And then she laughed, a real one. And it was warm and unguarded and sounded nothing like Claire's laugh, and I thought, this is a person I have not met before. which was both obvious and somehow the most important thing about the evening. She said, "What do you want? Not from tonight. In general. What are you trying to build?" I said, "I'm 41 years old, and I have 14 radios, and a therapist I see every other week, and a very good job, and a life that is organized and functional, and sometimes feels like a very well-maintained bridge that nobody walks across." I paused. I want someone to walk across it. I want it to matter to someone other than me that it holds. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "That's the saddest useful metaphor I've heard in a while." I said, "It's accurate." She said, "I know. That's why it's sad." She looked at the candle. I build bridges, and nobody is supposed to notice them. The whole point is invisibility. You build something so well that it disappears into the fabric of people's daily lives, and they cross it without thinking and arrive where they were going. I used to think that was enough, that the thing working was the whole point and recognition was vanity. I said, "What changed?" She said, "Someone asked me once, after a bridge opened, whether I was proud of it. I said, yes, of course. They said, does anyone know? And I realized the answer was essentially no. I had built something people used every day, and nobody in my life could see it, or touch it, or understand what it had cost to get right. The pride I felt was real, but it was completely private. And private pride is a thin thing to live on for very long. I said, "So you started telling people?" She said, "I started letting people in. To the work. To what the work cost. To the parts of myself I had been treating like load-bearing structures I couldn't touch." She paused. It turns out the same habit that makes you not talk about your bridge also makes you not talk about the relationship that's in trouble or the decision you're afraid to make. You get very good at the internal life and very out of practice with the shared one. I said, "My therapist would like you." She said, "The feeling would probably be mutual." I said, "Maybe the difference between your bridges and mine isn't the structure, it's the destination. You've decided where yours lead." I built something and left the other end open. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me in a while." I said, "I thought it was yours." She said, "I said the destination. You said the other end being open. That's the specific version." She leaned back slightly. "You haven't decided where you're going. That's fixable. The structure isn't the problem." I said, "You sound like someone who has diagnosed a lot of things." She said, "Engineering is mostly diagnosis. You figure out what the system is doing and what it should be doing, and you close the gap. The hard part isn't the analysis. It's admitting the gap is there before it becomes structural." I said, "My therapist says something very similar with different vocabulary." She said, "Smart people converge on the same truths. It's one of the more reassuring things about being a person." We stayed through the dessert neither of us needed and ordered anyway, and through a second glass of wine, and the restaurant had thinned around us to the last few tables by the time we noticed the hour. The waiter appeared with a patience I was grateful for and the check, and we did the conversation about splitting it that ended with us splitting it, which felt like the right version of the conversation for what the evening had been. Outside it was cold. The specific November cold that arrives with finality rather than warning, and we stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant while the city did its quiet late evening things around us. She said, "I'm going to call Claire tomorrow." I said, "Okay," she said, "not to tell her what happened tonight specifically, to check in. Because talking to you made me realize I've been letting that particular quietness go on longer than I should. And that's not about you. It's about me and the pattern of driving away from the things that make demands." I said, "Does she know you drove away from things?" She said, "She knows about some of them. Not all. But she's my sister, and whatever the quiet between us is, she is my sister, and that precedes everything." She looked at me directly. "I want you to know I'm saying that clearly and early. Not as a warning, just as a fact about who I am." I said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" I said, "I married into your family. I know what it means when you're a person for whom that precedes everything." I think that was one of the things I didn't fully appreciate while I was inside it. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a more honest thing to say than I expected." I said, "I've had 3 years and a good therapist." She looked at me with something that had softness and precision in it simultaneously. The face of someone who has just recalibrated something. She said, "I would like to do this again. I want to be clear that I don't know what that means in any larger sense, but I'm not ready for the evening to be a complete sentence." I said, "Neither am I." She said, "Okay." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "I'll call Claire tomorrow." I said, "Tell her I said." I stopped. I said, "Actually, don't tell her anything from me. Tell her whatever is true from you." She said, "That's the right answer." She walked to her car and I stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, and then I walked to mine and sat in it for a few minutes without starting it, the way I sometimes do when something has happened that I want to hold completely before I drive it home, and it becomes part of the furniture of my apartment among the 14 radios. I thought about a parking lot, and 4 minutes, and a decision. I thought about a bridge in Portland that would open in the spring, and the morning she was going to fly out there and stand on it and watch people walk across it without looking down. I thought about Claire, who had been generous in the telling of the story in a way I had not fully understood until I heard it reflected back by someone who loved her. I thought about what I had said about the bridge that nobody walked across, and what she had said about the destination, and I thought that she was right, that the destination was the missing variable, not the structure itself. I called Danny from the car before I started it. He answered on the second ring with the voice of a man who has been waiting to answer and knows it. I said, "You knew." He said, "I knew her last name. I knew your last name. I have known both of you for years from completely separate directions, and I put you in the same room and let the evening decide what to do with it." I said, "You should have told me." He said, "You wouldn't have gone." He was right. I would not have gone. I would have said it was too complicated, that the situation had too many moving parts, that the respectful thing was to stay out of anything that touched Claire's family, and I would have found all of those reasons completely convincing because they were not untrue. And then I would have eaten pasta over the sink and gone to bed, and the quiet of my well-organized life would have continued in exactly the shape it was already in. I said, "That's not the point." He said, "Marcus." I said, "I know." He said, "How was it?" I was quiet for a moment. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer was larger than the sentence I was trying to put it in. I said, "She sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes deciding whether to come in." He said, "I know. She texted me from the parking lot." I said, "She texted you." He said, "She said, 'His last name is Ardell. Please tell me this is a coincidence.'" I said, "Come in. It's not a coincidence. It's a plan." She didn't respond for 4 minutes. Then she walked in. I sat with that for a moment. The 4 minutes that I had understood as a private decision turned out to have had a witness, had been a negotiation conducted silently with a phone in a parking lot, and she had still chosen to walk in with all the available information. That changed the weight of it slightly, made it more deliberate, which made it mean more. I said, She builds bridges. She asked me why my marriage ended and listened to the actual answer. She told me the private pride of a thing nobody sees is too thin to live on. I paused. It was the most awake I felt in 3 years. He said, "Then everything I did was correct." I said, "You're going to say that forever." He said, "I'm going to say it every time I see you until it stops being true." He was not wrong, and I did not tell him so, because he did not need the confirmation. Simone called Claire the next morning. I know because Claire called me the next afternoon, for the first time in 8 months, and said, "Simone told me she had a strange evening, and that I should probably talk to you, and I'm not entirely sure what that means, but here I am." I told her the bare shape of it. Danny's arrangement, the restaurant, the evening. She was quiet for a long time, not the quiet of anger, not the quiet of hurt, but the particular quiet of someone taking in a piece of information that has reorganized something they thought they already understood. She said, "Are you okay?" Not as a challenge. As an actual question, in the voice of a person who has known you for 15 years, and still, underneath everything that has passed between you, wants the honest answer. I said, "I think I might be getting there." She was quiet for another moment. She said, "Good." She paused, and I could hear her finding the words for something she had been holding. She always made the hard choices, Marcus, just late. She drove away from things for years, and then one day she stopped driving away. She's been getting better at the timing. Another pause. "I think you might be the right thing to not drive away from." I said, "I'm getting better at a few things too." She said, "I know. I could tell, just now." Another pause. "Don't hurt her." I said, "I won't." She said, "I know you won't. I'm saying it anyway because she's my sister, and that's what I do." A pause, and then something softer. "I'm glad you're okay, Marcus, I mean that." I said, "I know you do." That phone call lasted 9 minutes. It contained more honesty between us than most of the conversations we had in the final year of our marriage, and I thought about that for a long time afterward. Not with grief, not with regret, but with the particular gratitude you feel for a person who is capable of being generous in a situation where nobody would fault them for being something else. Simone and I had dinner again 2 weeks later, at a different restaurant, smaller, no particular occasion. The conversation had the same quality as the first one, without the particular electricity of revelation. Not less good, differently good. The way a second read of a book you loved is not the same as the first, but has its own pleasures. The things you missed the first time. The things that mean more now that you know where they lead. She told me about the project after Portland, a footbridge over a canal in a city she wouldn't name yet because it wasn't confirmed. A commission she had been waiting on for 2 years. She said the waiting was the hardest part of her work. Not the engineering, not the construction, but the period between knowing exactly what you could build and being told whether you would be allowed to build it. I said I understood that feeling from a different direction, that the gap between knowing what you could offer and being in a context where the offer was welcome was its own particular patience. She said, "You're getting better at it." I said I had a good example. She looked at me when I said that in a way that she had, by then, stopped trying to conceal, and I was glad she had stopped. The Portland Bridge opened in March. She flew out on the first morning of its opening, the day before the public ribbon cutting, when only the construction crew and a few city officials were there, because she had negotiated into her contract the right to walk it first, before the public did, which she had told me about in November, and which I had thought about every few weeks since then, as a thing that told you everything you needed to know about someone. She sent me a photograph from the bridge at 7:14 in the morning Portland time. She was standing in the middle of it, with her arms slightly out, and her face turned toward the sky and the river visible below her, gray-green in the early light. And the bridge itself was simple and clean and clearly built by someone who understood that the best structures do not announce themselves. I kept the photograph in the folder on my phone, where I keep things I intend to look at more than once, which is a small folder. She came home from Portland 2 days later, and we had dinner that same evening, and she told me what it felt like to stand on something you had built from the inside out, the 2 years of calculations and material choices and load estimates, and the particular arguments with contractors about specifications that felt tedious at the time and turned out to be load-bearing in the literal sense. To stand on all of that made solid and know it would hold anyone who crossed it. She said it was the best feeling she had experienced in her professional life, and also one of the loneliest, because she had stood there at 7:14 in the morning with nobody else who understood what she was standing on. I said, "You had me." She said, "I sent you a photograph." I said, "You had me." She looked at me across the table for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, I did." She said it quietly, and it was the kind of quiet that is not absence of sound, but presence of something that doesn't need sound to hold its weight. I told her that was what I was trying to learn. Not the building. I had always known how to build things, the part where you let the thing you built be witnessed, where you let someone else know what it cost, where the pride stops being private because you have chosen to share the view. She said, "You're going to get there. You just needed to decide where the bridge goes." I said, "I think I'm deciding." She said, "I think so too." The 14 radios are still in my apartment. I have started listening to one of them in the evenings. It is from 1938, oak cabinet, the fabric over the speaker the color of old grass, and it receives 2 stations clearly and 2 with static. And I have stopped trying to fix the static because she pointed out that 2 clear stations is already most of what you need, and that the static on the other 2 is what lets you know the clear ones are actually clear. I listen to it with the lamp on and the rest of the apartment quiet, and it sounds exactly the way things sound when they have been repaired carefully and are being used for what they were made for, which is different, entirely, unmistakably different from the silence of a thing sitting in the corner waiting to be noticed. I do not know what I would tell Danny about what he did. I have tried many times to write the sentence that holds all of it, the presumption, the risk, the complete disregard for how it might have landed, and the way it turned out to be the most correct intervention anyone has made in my life in years. The sentence keeps being too long because it keeps needing to contain both things simultaneously, and I have not found a way to shorten it that is still true. He says I'm welcome. He says it every time we see each other, before I can say anything, while he is still looking at me with the face of a man who is sure he was right. He is not wrong. And Simone was right too. The structure was never the problem. The other end of the bridge just needed somewhere to go. And the 4 minutes in the parking lot on a Friday evening in November, the decision at the door, the thing nearly driven away from, that was the hinge. That was the whole thing the rest of it turned on. Have you ever been in a room you almost didn't walk into, with a person you almost didn't meet, and found that the almost was the most important part of the entire story? That the 4 minutes of sitting in the parking lot, the decision made at the door, was the hinge the rest of it swung on? Have you ever realized that the version of a thing that made the most demands was the only version that had room in it for what you actually needed? Have you ever been in a room you almost didn't walk into, with a person you almost didn't meet, and found that the almost was the most important part of the whole story? That the 4 minutes in the parking lot, the decision at the door, the thing you nearly drove away from, was the hinge the rest of it turned on? Have you ever realized that the complicated version of a thing was the only version that had room for what you actually needed?